I think humans have never had access to carbohydrate like we do now, right? Like even in agricultural societies, right? So this in the last, let's say 50 years, not even 100 years, 50 years, this explosion of processed foods and especially refined carbohydrate, right? Which we know that is linked to inflammation and is contra to the power to reduce that inflammation that these toxins have, right? Some of them are good at reducing inflammation. And so it's kind of like these two-sided thing, Dr. Kiltz. I think if you look at keto diet people, absolutely, it is anti-inflammatory in many ways. We know that's true, right? For certain pathways. Now, but then if we look at vegans who are eating a diverse diet of plants, but not tons of carbohydrate, right? They have a separate kind of anti-inflammatory thing going on from the thing I described, which is that consumption in those diverse plants of a little bit of these toxins is through the mechanisms I described, reducing inflammation in a different way. And this has been shown actually clinically.
I'm excited to have Noah Whiteman talk about most delicious poison. And I talk a lot about keto and carnivore and health and wellness, about what we eat. And the question is, do plants want to be eaten?
That, Rob, is a great question. The answer is it depends. So I'm Noah Whiteman. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley. I study evolution, and particularly something called coevolution, which is how evolution works between species, say plant and animal, say toxin and detoxification system, think monarch and milkweed. But your question is the one that I think about a lot. Do plants want to be eaten? And it depends what kind of plant you are, but especially what part of the plant you're talking about. So if you're talking about a leaf, I would say no. Most plants don't want to be eaten. That is where they're capturing the sun's energy, turning it into sugar, and then all the other things that plants can make using that sugar, like amino acids and fats and sterols and things like that. But if you're a fruit of a plant and you have evolved with animals and use the animals as a disperser, think a nutmeg, for example, that is growing right now, a big, beautiful Varroa tree in, say, Ecuador in the rainforest. And there might be 1,000 fruits in the canopy, and there might be toucans there that are going to take those nutmegs and swallow them whole. And then they're going to digest the fatty arrow that's around the nut. And then they may vomit that nut back up because they can't digest the nut, but then they might be 10 miles away from the mother plant. And that little nutmeg seed is going to sprout in a new place. And isn't that a miracle, right? Like just what I described. Now, the nut has toxins in it that would even be toxic to the toucan, but it doesn't digest them because that's a hard nut. But a seed predator like a weevil, a little beetle that would bore into that nut is protected from the seed predators by the alkaloids, the chemicals that are made as poisons that the plant is putting in there. So think of this as this multi-layered system where it depends where we are on the plant, who is the target, right, of whether it's an attraction or aversion molecule. Oh, the lights just went out in here. Let me turn that back on. So that's kind of what I think about a lot. But if you're, say you're a leaf or a stem of a plant, those usually, or a root, those are tissues that are going to help the plant grow and reproduce. So plants don't want those parts to be eaten. And plants have evolved many defenses. You can think of thorns on a rose stem as a defense against mammalian herbivores, primarily. You could think of the little tiny hairs that you might see in a leaf that might be a defense against both, small animals and even big ones. And then there are these invisible ones, these chemicals that the plants make for no other evolutionary purpose than defense against natural enemies like chewing herbivores, and including things like microbial pathogens as well. So it's this complex cocktail that is often in these leaves and stems that have evolved in response to pressure from things that are eating them.
The evolution of your story And curious a little bit about how you got into the evolutionary biology, and in this case specifically talk about plants, but the evolution of plants, microbes, and other animals, and including humans. How do we all fit in this together?
Right. So, if you think about our human lineage, we like to think of our species, Homo sapiens, and then our very close relatives, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, which are the archaic humans that have been recently discovered. Both
Mm-hmm.
in our genomes, we carry pieces of them with us in our genomes. And of course, they left skeletons and even tools in caves in places. So that group, evolved from a common ancestor a couple 100,000 years ago. But our primate lineage, right, is our ancestral lineage. We are primates. And so when we think about that, we think about we're a member of the great ape group. So chimpanzees, both common and pygmy chimps, are our closest relatives. Then we have
Mm-hmm.
orangutan gorillas, right? You can keep going out, stepping out in terms of distance from when we share a common ancestor with each of those. And if you go pretty far back with humans, it looks like, our ancestors were fruit feeding when they were initially sort of becoming bipedal. Okay, that's one of the hypotheses. So when our lineage, maybe the Homo erectus was the first thing we might recognize as a human. That species
Mm-hmm.
might be our immediate, sort of one of our immediate ancestors. You know, Before them, they were probably frugivorous, and a lot of primates are frugivorous. That means they primarily eat fruit. Chimps are an example of that. They're primarily frugivorous, our closest living relatives, right? But then something happened, and humans became very diverse in our feeding habits, depending on where you are in the world. Once our species dispersed around the world, right? We started occupying habitats that offered brand new resources, didn't have fruits. Say it was the Arctic, right? There's very few fruits up there. And what is there? Well, there are large animals there, right? Both fish and mammals and things like that. And so what's interesting is that over time, local populations of humans have absolutely adapted to the diet that is there. And then we have agriculture coming into the mix, right? So we have the hunter-gatherer side, which was probably the very first kind of behavioral acquisition of food was through that. And then we have agriculture, which came along, right? And these are not always everywhere the same, right? So some societies evolve agriculture,
Mm-hmm.
others don't. And so there's a lot of diversity even now in the human diet. And our bodies, our genomes, our DNA has kind of co-evolved with these local food sources, whatever they are. And I can talk more about that in a really fascinating way. So some of us, the one of the genes that's really important as a predictor of what kind of diet a human population has. And think of this as like an indigenous population, okay? Not the great mixing that's happened, but say, going back, 2,000 years before there was a ton of movement of humans very rapidly around the world and in each other's territories. There's an enzyme called an amylase, which you of course know about, that's secreted in our saliva that it pre-digests starch as we're chewing, right? So that's in our saliva, and the enzyme is called
Mm-hmm.
amylase, and that's really important in breaking starch down. Sorry, this light keeps going off. Um,
It's okay. Yeah, it's okay. We'll keep going. Go ahead.
okay, so that
So the amylase.
Yeah, so amylase is present in the mouths of humans and all other primates, dogs, and it allows them to pre-digest the starch. Now, there is the number of genes. So there's an amylase gene in your genome, but there's usually multiple copies of it. So there might be one gene here of amylase, and right next door in the DNA, the same gene. So then you make twice as much amylase. Now there's a third gene, 3 times, 4, 5, all the way up to like 25 copies. And it depends on the individual. Some people have a few, some people have up to 25. And if you look at the distribution of people and their genomes and how many copies of amylase they have, my colleagues, including at Berkeley, Peter Sudman, they have discovered that you can kind of predict what kind of diet those populations have based on that. And just as you would guess, if it's high starch, guess what? They have more amylase copies. So this is something that's very rapidly evolved in humans over the last, 10,000 years, maybe a little longer. This what we call copy number variation in the gene
Uh,
number
uh,
that
uh,
encodes the
uh,
enzyme amylase. So societies that are hunter-gatherer, that are say mainly fishing and shellfish, would have fewer copies of amylase, and then more agriculturally oriented societies, no matter where they are, whether say they're in Japan, with rice, or say potatoes, in South America, there's convergent evolution, repeated origins of these same patterns, where you'll have the copy number going up, being favored by natural selection, the copy number going down if it's more of a protein diet, right? So you see this. I thought you would be interested in this because you absolutely see this, and we're not all the same. Like there are differences, but they're subtle, is what I would say. And
hmm.
but you can predict the local diet to some extent with something like that. It's more complicated than that, but that's one example of, like, at least us sort of adapting with our food environment, right?
Right. So the plants are live organisms, like we are live organisms. They evolved well before we evolved, and obviously they have certain characteristics that enable them to survive in their environment. Also, is did we as human beings, as we are today, evolve eating primarily meat, animals, or plants? Or do you think the evidence really suggests we ate both in general?
Yeah, I do think the thing that we would recognize as a human probably evolved originally as mostly fruit feeding, okay, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
probably eventually picking stuff off the ground, because there's a bipedal transition. This is a very important moment. And it's sort of, because you imagine the fruits are up in the trees, right? And chimps are going up there getting them, right? Chimps aren't bipedal. They're collecting some on the ground too, but humans, yes, we can climb trees, but it's much harder for us to do that. So the focus of humans became what's on the ground, and that is when things started to shift. So it looks like the immediate ancestors of us were absolutely frugivorous. I'd be willing to bet my life on that. But then there was this sort of broadening of the diet, right? And then tubers are involved, so that was another major source of energy, right? And that's when Rob, our brains started getting much larger. And there's this brain gut trade-off hypothesis, right? That is starting to push us away from a plant-based diet and more toward, starch, which is plant, but it's pretty simple, right? Compared to the fibrous nature of a fruit even. So one hypothesis that Richard Wrangham has is that it's sort of these underground tubers that became part of our diet that was associated with this ability of our brain to get bigger, because they are such sinks for glucose, right? I mean, we are using way more glucose than a chimpanzee brain is. So that's got to be fed somehow. Now, at some point, then, yes, there was a broadening, and then animals come into the picture, right? As a source of food. And so I would say there was this broadening, and then again, it would relate to where these populations were, what was available to, right? And then tools, culture, right, is now all of a sudden
Mm-hmm.
also
Mm-hmm.
co-evolving with us and our genes. And it's this amazing thing, right? That humans think about where we've been able to colonize. Every single landmass in the world has had humans colonize it, except Antarctica. This is amazing for a species. There are very few species like this, right? That were able to do this. And absolutely, it's our bipedalism. It's our ability to be flexible and use what's there, and use these big brains, right, to take advantage of nature, to harness it, agriculture, domestication of animals, to use their products like milk, right? We have pastoralist societies around the world still. That's another example of convergent evolution. They have lactase persistence. So lactase is another enzyme that many people know about, that some adults like me, I'm lactase persistent. You can probably tell I have Northwestern European ancestry. Many people from that region have lactase persistence.
Mm-hmm.
That means, after weaning, until they die, they can digest lactose. And most humans cannot do that. So most people in the world as adults cannot digest lactose, But then there are 4 other examples of this independently evolving in African pastoralist populations. And these are people that are raising ungulates and using primarily the milk and the milk products as the major food source, not just, protein source, like everything, like keto, So like that's super interesting. And these mutations in the lactase gene that keep it turned on have been identified in each of those populations, and they're all different. So that shows us that, lightning strikes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. It's associated with this cultural practice. So you can think of the cultural practice co-evolving with our own genome, the
Uh-huh.
diet, right?
Uh-huh.
And this is just another example like the amylase thing, where you can find signatures of adaptation in the genome. They're subtle, but they're there and they're real. And they reveal to us both our flexibility, but also like, there are constraints and there's ways of getting better at it that evolution has trained certain populations to do.
So we talk about plant poisons, and other organisms. They have poisons, um, and maybe some people are able to tolerate these poisons more readily than others. Is that sort of similar to lactase? That they have ability. So peppers, or other substances you talk
Yeah,
about, and maybe you could talk a
right.
little bit about these
Ab-
substances,
Absolutely.
like obviously peppers and caffeine and things like that, where we enjoy.
Right. Yeah. So your first question that I never answered, Rob, was like plants evolved, 450 million years ago, 450 million years ago, from a single lineage of green algae that was living in the water. Okay. And all
Mhm.
land plants are descended from that event. And what's interesting is right around the same time, animals were starting to colonize land as well, which makes sense because animals need plants, right? Initially, that first jump. But there were also, were predators that were in the first arthropods that were on land, which eventually became insects, mites, spiders. They're eating each other, right? They're eating detritus. Eventually, they jump onto plants. Plants are hard, just because of what you said. So the plants are sessile, which means they don't move, right? They're sitting ducks. So they've evolved ways of defending themselves that are very different from our bodies. So we can run. Plants can't run. We can swim, we can dig, we can hide. They can't. And so they have to be out in the open because they're photosynthesizing. That makes them super vulnerable. So what natural selection did is it selected for plants that were making chemicals that animals don't like, but they have to be more than that. They have to pack an honest signal. They have to pack a punch, because otherwise the animals will figure out, yeah, they're bitter, but they're still good and they're not going to hurt me. So those bitter things that are in plants had to be toxic in order for the whole thing to work, right? Or the animals would find a way
Mhm.
around.
Mhm.
So for 450 million years, plants have been diversifying in part because they're protected from natural enemies to some extent. But the animals eventually, some overcome them and figure out ways through evolution to specialize on them. But the toxins can still work against most enemies. Now, if you think about it, most of the things eating plants are tiny. They're insects, and the dose makes the poison, right? So a lot of the levels
Right.
of the toxins in the plants evolved to at levels no higher than needed to do the job, right? And so a little bit of toxin, say a little bit of caffeine for a caterpillar, will kill the caterpillar. The amount that's in a coffee bean or a tea leaf, we know that absolutely is an insecticide and will kill all insects except things like the coffee berry borer beetle, which is adapted to them. But to us, caffeine can kill us too. It certainly has killed people. But you have to take a lot of it, and that goes back to the dose thing. We are large animals, humans. If you look at the biomass of humans compared to other things, right? We are big creatures, and because of that, we have big livers. And even though we have a smaller gut than our ancestors did, it's still big. So we have the ability, Rob, to detoxify a broad array of things pretty
Mhm.
well. But there are differences between people and their genotypes and their enzymes. So I'm a fast caffeine detoxifier because I have cytochrome P450 that I know the particular variant is really good at detoxifying caffeine. So I can drink more of it. You might be a slow metabolizer. These are both at pretty high frequency in the population. So what does that mean? Well, you will adjust your behavior. We can predict this based on your genotype. And if we also have differences in whether we sense whether something's bitter or not.
Hmm.
So, and sometimes that can be a thing where you don't like it, but sometimes there's counterintuitive stuff like the bitter tasting people, if they also have a fast caffeine detoxification ability, they will train themselves like, oh, actually, I like the black coffee. I like the bitter. I'm going to drink more of it because they need to in order for the caffeine to make its way to their brain because they're so
Hmm.
fast at eliminating it. So there are all these, you're absolutely right. Just like with the amylase and the lactase thing, there are differences between us in our abilities to detoxify these plant toxins and also in our, say, the targets of the toxins. And one example is the adenosine receptor that caffeine targets. Some
Hmm.
people are good at binding it and others aren't. And that also influences how much you're going to drink. And we can predict this. People have done studies where, give me the genotype, you can do a genome-wide association study, and there is some heritable variance here that is explained by the things I'm talking about. Even though I would say overall, humans are really good in general at detoxifying stuff, which may explain why our diets are so broad most of the time, right? Yeah. But there are
We
limits.
most we mostly tolerate a lot of these plant chemicals. I guess that probably is evolutionarily related because we didn't die from those things and they weren't so harsh, so we
Right.
found ways to enjoy them. Is so in fact we human beings are also doing the work for the plants to make them more abundant,
Totally.
place them in places around the world that they've never been in, and maybe even making their genetic environment, their own genome, more resilient.
Absolutely. So what you're talking about is all of a sudden, from the plant's evolutionary perspective, if you're a plant that humans have domesticated or at least growing and bringing around the world, like say coffee, one of my favorite coffees is Kona coffee from Hawaii. Well, guess what? It's not native to Hawaii.
Right,
Coffee,
right,
right?
right.
Coffee's native to like Ethiopia, right? So just there. But now, if you look at where coffee's grown around the world, anywhere where it can be grown, it is grown. And so humans have now sort of expanded the niche of coffee, expanded its evolutionary potential in ways that the coffee plant has really benefited from an evolutionary perspective. And then you're right, there are things, traits that humans are selecting for in some of these crops. And sometimes it is to reduce the toxic, bitter things. Absolutely, that has happened. Other times where it might be, this is kind of interesting, Rob. You think about cassava, which is also called yucca, right? That was a euphorbia, a spurge plant domesticated by Amazonian indigenous people, then used as a food source. They always keep two kinds around, a bitter kind and a sweet kind. One has more cyanide than the other, and maybe the higher cyanide having it around reduces herbivore populations. So they're right, the local people know what they're doing.
Hmm.
And that same strategy exists where cassava was brought 400 years ago into Africa during the transatlantic slave trade, where now indigenous African populations are growing cassava, processing it in many of the same ways to get the cyanide out, but the cyanide's still there in the raw plant and it protects the plants from being eaten. So you can grow cassava in places where you can't grow a lot of other crops. They're super resistant. So you can think of the chemicals as these two-sided things. They're tools for us. They might hurt us. They might help us. It's all very context dependent. But if you look at the local people, they know what they're doing, and they're aware. They were aware of these chemicals long before. So the problem exists now. Like, look at our diet. When you go to a supermarket, there's tons of stuff there, right? So it's a really different world than our ancestors evolved in. And this brings up a whole other set of questions, right? We have fruits and vegetables from all over the world that say your, population didn't evolve with. What does that mean for us, right? It's an interesting question, but like we said, luckily we're big, we're pretty good at detoxifying, but we know there are differences in tolerance and resistance and detoxification between people, right? And that is also true.
The abundance of food, and we see a rise in diabetes, hypertension, cancer, stroke, and many other diseases that are inflammatory. What are the effects of this over uh, uh, access to plants that we did not have access because we didn't evolve in that environment, as you were saying. What are the
Yeah.
effects on these things that you could talk about?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that for a lot of, dietary toxins that might not be super toxic to us, many of them actually reduce inflammation by triggering an anti-stress response in us. So
Uh-huh.
say if I eat a little wasabi or radish or broccoli, kale, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, watercress, that's a plant family I study. They all are called mustard oils in them. So that's the spicy, peppery taste that you get. That evolved to keep insects at bay. And I study that chemical system, so I know it really well. And we use fruit flies as a model. And it turns out fruit flies detoxify those mustard oils the same way we do, that humans do. We use the mercapturic acid pathway, glutathione S transferases. And those enzymes are they're conjugating, they're linking glutathione in your cell to this toxin, and that immediately makes it less toxic, and it's excreted in the urine. So what's interesting about this is that if you give a fruit fly a stressor, say like this terrible chemical called paraquat, which creates reactive oxygen species, if you give the flies a little broccoli extract before you give them the paraquat, they will live longer. In other words, the
Hmm.
broccoli primes their system that would be to detoxify the paraquat so it's sort of anticipating what's coming. And so, you can translate that to humans, and there have been a lot of studies on this. These mustard oils. One is called sulforaphane. You've probably heard of it. That's the main mustard oil in broccoli. You can order pills of this now. And what that does is, just as I said in fruit flies, in us, it's upregulating my glutathione transferase levels, and that is thought to have this knockdown effect later, sort of this anticipatory effect of both, our own toxins that we're making and then toxins that we would get in the diet. So that's one thing. But if you take too much of it, of course, it's toxic. But the other side about the overabundance of food and not having a diverse diet, and if we think about chronic diseases and what's going on, well, I think humans have never had access to carbohydrate like we do now, right? Like even in agricultural societies, right? So this in the last, let's say, 50 years, not even 100 years, 50 years, this explosion of processed foods and especially refined carbohydrate, right? Which we know that is linked to inflammation and is contra to the power to reduce that inflammation that these toxins have, right? Some of them are good at reducing inflammation. And so it's kind of like these two-sided thing, Dr. Kiltz. I think if you look at keto diet people, absolutely, it is anti-inflammatory in many ways. We know that's true, right? For certain pathways. And then the vegan diet, which a diverse vegan diet, right? So those are, but if you look at the biomarkers of those two populations, they both have lower inflammation, but in different ways and in different organs and things like that. Okay. But then this diet that we've been exposed to for 50 years in the Western world, this high carbohydrate, refined carbohydrate diet, that's a terrible way to live, right? And if you want to look into the answer of chronic diseases, look there is what I think, right? And many other people think.
I,
But I do think this
I was
nuance is
thinking,
really interesting. But yeah, between the veganism and the keto, it's like um, there are two ways of thinking about how to deal with this problem, two tools from indigenous populations that we can think about, right? That's super interesting.
my daughter's allergic to bananas and avocados. Oh, a banana that's raw but cooked. She
I'm,
doesn't
I,
seem to have an allergy.
yes, Rob, I'm the same way. And it's because of a type of starch that the banana has that is, if you think this is why plants are so amazing. So that fruit doesn't want to be eaten until it's ready. So what is it going to do? It's going to prevent animals from eating it. How does it do that? We know the answer. It makes the starch so that you can't digest it. And I get a stomach ache if I eat bananas, and I'm super sensitive to that kind of starch. Apparently, your daughter is too. Give me a fried
Mm-hmm.
plantain. Give me a fried plantain any day. As a treat, and I will love that. I won't have any symptoms, but I cannot eat raw bananas either. So there's an example of like we're responding to this. The plants are sort of, they know us, right? I mean, the banana wants its seeds dispersed, but only when it's ripe and ready is the point.
So let's take a raw potato versus a cooked potato. are they different poison or non-poison?
Yes. So, potatoes are really interesting because the Incan Empire, right? The Andean peoples who domesticated these amazing tomato family plants. And if you look at the indigenous varieties of these potatoes, they're like every color in the rainbow. It's
Yeah.
amazing. They're small, beautiful, blue, red, orange, yellow, and but they're bitter because they have these solanaceous alkaloids like solanine, which can be pretty toxic to us. And so if this is why your parents said don't ever eat a green potato, right? Because if that outside of that potato gets exposed to sunlight, the potato isn't a root, it's actually a stem of the underground stem. So this is why a potato is capable
Hmm.
of growing a shoot right from it. So when I was young and we planted potatoes in our garden, we would go to the co-op and get seed potatoes, just a little triangle that of some woman who had a variety that she would bring and sell to the co-op, and then it would be in a little paper bag. I'd put it in the ground, and then 3 weeks later, I'd have this huge plant, and I was so excited about it. But I remember sometimes you'd see the potatoes growing near the surface, they'd be green. And I remember thinking, I'm not supposed to eat that. Why? Because the green material, that's photosynthetic tissue, and we know what that means. They're going to protect themselves from
Ah,
predators, and that's where the toxins are made. So that's why a green potato, you shouldn't eat it. There's solanine in it, which is a pretty toxic glycoalkaloid. So this is what the Andean people did. Knowing this is just incredible. To get those solanines out of the potatoes, and the wild varieties have more, right? These solanines in them than the domesticated ones. They use these terracotta pots to bind the solanine. So they would process the potatoes in the terracotta pots to pull out the toxins before they would cook them. So because you cook the solanine, it's still there. It doesn't break down. So and some toxins do break down that way, but some don't. And so this is one that doesn't. And so you have to be really careful. And they knew this, and they developed all this culture around the potato agriculture, right? So, but I don't put my potatoes in a terracotta pot. So much of this information that's important for processing the toxins is lost in translation. But we're in this new world where we have access to all these things, and yes, many of them are processed in a way where it's not super toxic, but still it's really interesting to think about all of what you're talking about, this kind of dialectic between the plants, us, native cultures, and how they mitigated the effects of the toxins or even used them sometimes to their own benefit.
maybe you could tell a little brief story how you got into the interest in plants and the area that you're in your
Yeah.
studies.
So I was born in Orange County, and then my parents moved to northeastern Minnesota, where they're from, and our relatives were there, so they wanted to raise us with them. And my dad was a naturalist, hunter, fisherman, very much into eating his own meat. And, we went fishing every weekend or hunting. And I was dragged
Uh-huh.
along. I mostly liked it. The only part I didn't like was rifle hunting deer. I just didn't like it. And I think it's because my first exposure to hunting deer was with archery, bow and arrow. So I shot a white-tailed deer at the age of 14, 200 feet from our house in my blind that he had set up for me, and
Wow.
quite an experience. And field dressed it with him. We opened it up. The huge stomach. It looked like someone had taken just a butcher knife and chopped up romaine lettuce in the same size pieces. So whatever that doe ate was there, and it was all the same plant, and it was in tiny pieces. I'll never forget this. And it was not digested at all. And it was in her first, this big stomach that she had. But then, she had a big liver. I noticed that. There were parasites in her that I saw. There were liver flukes. And so this made a huge impression on me. I remember it like it was yesterday. And of course, then we hung the deer up to dry, and then our friend butchered it and made sausage, and then we ate that deer the whole winter. That was the deal. So, like, I was exposed to this as a kid. And we had milkweeds in front of our house just growing wild, and monarchs are visiting from Mexico, right? Like, what?
Yeah, yeah.
These tropical plants that also are tropical. They invaded after the last ice age. The monarchs followed them. right? 10,000 years ago, there they are at the north end of the range in Minnesota, in my front yard, these tropical visitors. What are they doing? You know, and you rip the plant open, milk, sappy milk is dropping out of that. And my dad's saying, don't ever, you know, eat that. It's very poisonous, but there's a caterpillar eating it. How can that be? You know, and so, and I later, you know, in my life, when I was 40 years old, we used CRISPR gene editing to figure out how the monarch butterfly resists the hard poisons in that plant. So, and that's probably the work I'm best known for. So my childhood in nature, totally intertwined in it, is absolutely why I'm a biologist. And then what I see now is I grew up in a rural place. Most of my colleagues did not. Like most people in the country, they live in cities. And yes, many of them have outdoor interests and, you know, are birders or naturalists, and they can be very, very big fans of nature. However, when you're growing up in it and you're eating stuff every day that you catch from it, right? It's a different experience, I think. And because of that, I have what I found in my field of evolutionary biology and genetics, I have a unique perspective to bring. And that natural history knowledge that brought me into this continues to motivate me. And so that's how I got into it. It was very much not from a quote unquote science background, but if you think about it, it was. Of course, my dad was a scientist, just like every naturalist is. Every
Yeah,
farmer,
yeah,
every anyone who's working outside to get their food is a scientist, right? So this is how I think of science. It's like, yes, we have a very specific, narrow definition of our modern view of what science is. I get that as a Western European invention, and it was. However, human nature is scientific. This is why science, everyone actually loves science, right? There's mistrust of scientists, right? Depending on where you are in the country. But you know, of science itself, I actually don't think there is. I think that people are really capable of discerning, right, patterns. And so, yes, and want to know for themselves. They want to see the data, show me the data, show me the pattern. Don't just tell me, involve me. I'm smart, I'm a human like any other. So I think no matter what your education level is, people are predisposed as scientists to discern what's going on in nature because that's where our food is, right? And that's where our enemies are. So, like, right, both the human and non-human. And we have to have a knowledge of natural systems that allows us to persist and take advantage of our environments, right? And also be aware of some of the dangers that are in it. And this is where it gets really interesting when it comes to plants and our interaction with them. And so to me, it was, you know, Rob, to answer your question, it was an absolutely natural progression of my childhood.
and it sounds like you're still co-evolving in that childhood today and enjoying it. And I imagine, because I know medicine, you know, I still feel like a little kid in all the things that are going on and we're learning each and every day. And certainly education and what you're doing is quite remarkable. And your book, Most Delicious Poison, which again, I talk about this book all the time. And tell us a little bit about what got you to bring this together
Yeah,
and talk about the things that
sure.
make us feel good and kill us.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, Rob, thank you for that. You know, I've listened to your show, and I appreciate that you are enjoying the book, and I hope your listeners have been enjoying you talking about it. I just want to give a shout out to you too. What you have done to make access to reproductive, you know, healthcare, IVF available for everyone is inspiring, and it's a great thing
Thank you.
that you've done. And I want you to know that. And I appreciate you. And think of all the babies, all the life that you have made
Oh,
happen. So it's got to be very fulfilling. So just like I'm an educator and also, you know, so I love mentoring students. Today I'm here with 16 PhD students right at the California Academy of Sciences, giving them a tour behind the scenes with my friends who are scientists here. I'm very passionate about this because I think that, you know, science is so key to our future as a society, as a country, right, as in the world. That this is the scientific enterprise in its best is the engine of innovation in our country, and it's really the future. And so I hope your listeners understand and believe that most people like me and you are working very hard to fulfill our potential as scientists, right? And I take that very seriously.
absolutely.
And my role as educator, basic researcher, and hopefully some of that stuff that bubbles up will be used by smart business people to take some of the discoveries that people like me are making, and then yes, to develop them into technology that can help society. But in the meantime, I'm an educator. So what happened was, the reason I wrote the book, Rob, is my dad died of alcohol use disorder, which
Yeah.
is now the
Yeah.
clinical term for alcoholism. And when I was studying the monarch butterfly and its ability to resist the heart poisons, which are drugs, by the way, digitalin and digoxin that are from the foxglove are the same chemical family. That those drugs are used to treat things like arrhythmia, and they used to be used to treat congestive heart failure, as you know. The milkweeds make them too, convergently evolved, independently evolved in milkweeds. Like, why reinvent the wheel, right? These plants are very clever from an evolutionary perspective. Those toxins target the sodium pump of our cells, which are really important at maintaining a sort of resting membrane potential, keeping the balance of sodium potassium right inside and outside the
Hmm.
cell. Those toxins target that because plants don't have one. They don't have a sodium pump. So this is a very clever invention. They have a toxin that doesn't bother them at all, doesn't affect them at all, but in small doses could kill you, could kill an insect. So this is a very amazing thing. And this is, I was studying this. The monarch is amazing because it's eating the milkweed, it's specialized on them, and it's pulling those toxins into its body, keeps them in its body through development, and sequesters it so the levels are higher than they are in the plant by the time the caterpillar is ready to turn into a chrysalis, keeps them in its body through metamorphosis, emerges as a monarch. It's brightly colored because the bird brain selected that. Don't eat me or I'm going to hurt you. And if the bird eats the monarch, it's going to either die or vomit or get very sick. So the signaling between the bird and the butterfly is co-evolving. The vision system
Wow.
of the bird,
Wow.
and those monarchs are poisonous their whole journey down to Mexico because of the toxins in their bodies that they got when they were caterpillars. So then in my mind, I'm like, wow, I'm studying kind of the same thing that my dad is doing. The monarchs are using toxins to keep these enemies at bay, the birds at bay. He's using toxin to keep his psychological enemies at bay. And for him, it was, trauma, abuse as a kid that he was escaping, right? And couldn't not do it. He had to do it to feel normal, and
Hmm.
also had some physical neck injuries from a motorcycle accident. It all sort of was abused as a child. So this is a sad story. But at the same time, when he died, I didn't know what to do. To make sense of the situation, these things started whirling around together in my mind. Like, wow, I've actually been kind of studying something that's like the mirror of him. And so then I thought, as a way of processing it, I wanted to write this book and make it a broader story. And then it evolved into this very broad story about, as you said, humans and our encounters with plants, and all the good, all the bad, all the ugly, and sort of how we have taken plants and, as I said before, use them as tools for food, medicine, and weapons, actually, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
indigenous cultures everywhere, every single one does the same thing. They go to the local plants, right? There's information gleaned from them, and the information's passed down from one generation to the next. Is it food? Is it medicine? Well, there's usually a gray area there, right? And is it a weapon? Yes, sometimes these concoctions made, right, are used as in the tip to tip blow darts or on arrows. All tropical cultures do this, no matter where they are. Philippines, Amazon, they'll tap into trees making the same thing that evolved independently. And those people don't know each other. So this is the other thing. It's like every human culture does this, and this is part of what it means to be human, is our relationship with plants as tools. So that's really what the book's about.
Because it's not just the science, it's a story, which and it's a human story that
Right.
so many of us have experienced in our
Right.
own lives. And I
Yes.
think that's why it's such a great read. And I highly recommend, because you just do such a great job in telling the story. Alcohol. Obviously, plants and microbes are working together in creating this very valuable substance that really we evolved with it in some ways. So, why do we love it so much, and why can't we stop consuming
Well, if I knew the answer to that,
it?
but that's the million, maybe the $1 billion
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
So just backing up a little, when you think about ethanol, which is drinking alcohol, right? And that is actually, most plants can make ethanol, and they do it under stress. But ethanol that we drink is made by yeast, right? Brewer's yeast. And Yeast are kind of amazing because they can use sugar in a variety of different ways, and if they're deprived of oxygen, they can make ethanol. And the crazy thing about ethanol is that for the yeast, they're resistant to ethanol levels that are quite high, maybe 20%. And most other microbes, bacteria, yeast, and other things cannot live anywhere near that. So they're by creating this chemical, the yeast and their rotten fruit niche, which is where the wild yeast live, or bark of trees or wherever, they're turning that little niche, that little habitat that they're in, into a toxic place that only they can live in. So this is the first thing. That's pretty amazing. The second part that makes it, I think, actually, Rob, is the coolest toxin out there, because it's a toxin and they can use it as an energy source. Sorry, I didn't mean to. I have my fireworks happening.
No, I love it. I have the same thing too.
So those twin things are there. So I call it in the book the toxic larder. So the yeast have created this toxic niche. Okay. Now, the other incredible thing is that humans, and probably my colleague Robert Dudley has shown this, chimpanzees are also encountering ethanol in the fruit that they eat at pretty high levels sometimes, if you think about how much fruit they're eating over the course of the day. So our ancestors were interacting with ethanol, right? But to what extent, of course, is an open question. Then comes along the ability to ferment, which we know evolved many times independently in humans, human cultures, right? Thousands of years ago. And fermenting what? What are they fermenting? Carbohydrate, whether it's corn, whether it's rice, is it barley, is it, right? So, but it's always some carbohydrate. And then they're adding things like, oh, let's add some hops to it. Well, why would you do that? Well, it also keeps other microbes at bay that can invade the ethanol, because there are a few other ones that can. It also allows it to maybe store longer, things like that. So then this whole kind of, cultural phenomenon of brewing takes over. It's safe to drink, so it's a water source and it's an energy source. And at low concentration, they're feeding it to children. So this is part of our deep culture, our, especially the agricultural culture. Of course, it probably started before that, but it's pretty recent, I would say, in some ways. This gets at your question a little, Rob, that this is a relatively recent invention of humans. So our bodies are big, we can handle it, but there are downstream consequences that are negative. And one of them is the acetaldehyde toxin that may well be very carcinogenic. Okay, so that's one thing. It's probably binding to our GABA A receptors in our brain, which is why Shakespeare said, good wine, good company, and good friends make for a good life, right? So it's like a little bit is a social, it greases the wheels, right? Because it's reducing our inhibition. But the GABA receptor is not the only thing that's going on, because that acetaldehyde later is working on other things. And this is why you wake up groggy in the morning sometimes. Like, I'm 48. If I have a glass of beer, I will be a little groggy in the morning, you know? So you see the effects of this. Yet I still drink beer, even though my dad died of alcoholism. But I'm lucky that I'm not compelled to drink more than one. I don't want to.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
right. And so some of us are more or less susceptible. We don't know why, Rob. Some
Mm,
of it is genetic. There's a heritable component. Some of it is learned. And some of it is context dependent. In other words, trauma dependent. And you can
hmm
predict to some extent someone's propensity for alcoholism. Give me a list of what's happened in their life to them that was neglect, abuse, trauma. And, not that's not perfectly correlated, but guess what? It is correlated. And there's a reason for this. Our big brains have long memories, right, including of bad things. And the using these chemicals, this is what's called the paradox of drug reward. These things that evolved as toxins we take on, but the other part of it is, Rob, kids don't do this. Children don't do this. Why? They find it all very aversive. They don't want beer. They don't want coffee. They don't want to smoke cigarettes. But then something happens at around age 11 or 12. And then in every culture, pretty much, adolescents start sampling this stuff. Well, what's happening? Their brains are getting bigger. Their bodies are getting bigger. They're losing bitter taste buds. So why would a child have more bitter receptors in their tongue than an adult? Why would a pregnant woman have fewer than one who's not, or have more than one who's not? The answer seems to be that these toxins in us, they may just be affecting our brain, but in people who are growing with rapidly dividing cells, or they're carrying a rapidly dividing baby, cells in the baby, those toxins can impact those cells in a different way. And that is absolutely true for alcohol, for example, right? We know that a mother exposed to ethanol is going to have a baby that will have an anatomically identifiable problems, right? So this is why I think, if you think about what's going on here, right? It's like our bodies, there's a developmental trajectory there that is linked to our use of these chemicals that are there in the environment that we and our ancestors are using to make our lives better. And sometimes, it's really imperfect. They weren't made for us. They didn't evolve with us in mind. And, the nervous system of a fly and the nervous system of a human are very similar. So the initial target from the plant's perspective might have been an insect 200 million years ago. Well, that'll still bind to my receptor. I'm not the target, but then it's a can of worms because now I have a lot of agency and I can take another drink. And so now you see the problem, right? Like this thing that didn't evolve with me in mind that can be used as a medicine or even as a, way to kind of get through the day. There's a tipping point where then you need it to feel normal. And so if I have a misregulated brain because of something that happened to me as a child, well, the alcohol serves a purpose, right? So, and that can end your life. It can make your life end earlier, right? So there's this cost, this two-sidedness to these toxins. Yeah.
Ultimately, most of our medications that we use pharmaceutical wise came from herbal plants. And
That's right.
so I guess what would the world be like if the plants didn't have these substances? Would we have evolved as we are today?
I love that question, and I think the answer is no, we would not, because right, I think for what it means to be human, like every human culture relies on plant specialized metabolites to make their way through life, and their medicines, they're used in spiritual practice. They're so linked to our culture
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
we can't undo that. We can't unravel that. So you think of it as like this third thing there. That's right. There's us, there's our food, and then there's these chemicals that are there. And now it's like there's sort of two sides of the same coin, this food medicine thing. And I think that's where most of them come from, is sampling what's in the backyard, right? And if you think about where most of the medicines come from, Rob, you're right, plants and animals from nature, but they're not the most exotic plants. They're plants in people's backyards. That's where people are getting them. Now, it might be in the Amazonian rainforest backyard, but they're plants people recognize, their elders knew, their ancestors knew, they know how to use them. Those are, if you look at our medicines, the medicines we have are enriched for those plants that indigenous people have been using. They're not a random tree in the rainforest that's not being used, even though there could be medicines there, right, that we could identify. Those aren't the ones that make their way into the pharmacopoeia as easily. They're the ones that we know are already being used for purposes that are similar and different from the ones they ultimately end up being used as pharmaceuticals. So yeah, we would not be human. Maybe Rob, you and I might not even be here because of it,
I mean,
right?
it's
Yeah.
potentially there was an
Yeah.
evolution in us because of this. And I just wonder how much DNA was placed into our DNA from the plants. We know that
Mhm.
microorganisms and viruses can put their
Yeah.
DNA into our DNA. And so I just wonder about plants. And the other thing is, I grew up in LA and Orange County, Newport Beach area.
Okay.
Um, and as a teenager, I used to grow marijuana, but it was very, and I just wonder though, because
Oh,
nowadays it's so created to be so
yes,
highly
totally.
potent, where
Right.
I smoke, I mean, it was like very minimal. And I think maybe that's part of our problem. We've commercialized it to way to make it this highly productive process rather than just
Yeah.
allowing nature to produce something and overusing it.
I totally agree with you. I think this is a huge problem that is completely understudied. And I remember my mom talking about it back. She was like, "Don't smoke marijuana now because it's way more powerful." And I'd be like, "What?" And she would say, "Well, people are growing it in farms, and so I think you're right that it is the dose that makes the poison. And If you think
Yeah.
about what come in a little cartridge, right, that people are vaping too, even if it's nicotine, like that is a pack of cigarettes can be in one of these little modules that people are vaping. This is something that is, we need to really think about this. I think what we are allowing people to have access to without a
Yeah.
lot of study is what I'm saying. I'm not saying ban it. I'm just saying we got to know more. We got to know
Yeah.
more about. Yeah.
Any closing comments or anything I didn't ask that you wanted to get to those listeners?
No, the only thing is the book ends with this arc where I ask you to think about our world, geopolitics. So, and just this little facet that Northwestern Europe went around, sent ships around the Cape of Good Hope to find black pepper in India
Yeah.
and spices that set off the world that we now live in. They were in search of piperine. They were in search of myristicin and nutmeg, okay, that was only growing nutmeg on a group of islands called the Moluccas in what are the Spice Islands, the Banda Islands. And eventually the Dutch and the English are fighting over this through colonization. And the British get kicked out, but they sign a treaty with the Netherlands and they trade the last island that has nutmeg called Rune for New Netherlands, which is New York. And this Treaty of Breda in 1667 gives New York to Great Britain. So if you think about our country, the history of it,
Mm-hmm.
you can think of all of this as in the pursuit of these alkaloids that these tropical plants are making that for some reason people became obsessed with in
Yeah.
Northwestern Europe. Right. And it's not just that, because once Britain got kicked out of the spice trade, what did they do? They went to India where they already had control, were growing poppies, moved opium into the mouth of the Pearl River, got a third of the Chinese male population addicted to opium. Opium War breaks out because the Chinese emperor bans it. We get the Treaty of Nanjing that gives Britain Hong Kong as a result of the fact that Britain now had this huge trade deficit with China because they were drinking tea grown there because they're addicted to caffeine. So they had to rebalance their trade deficit with the opium. So we have, okay, what do we have? We have the morphine, we have caffeine, we have myristicin, and piperine. Those four things can
Wow.
kind of explain the state of the world. And why did those things evolve? Not for us. They evolved to keep things away from those plants. So that's right. So that's what I want your people to think about. Like this is a lens that I learned that you can use to view the world in a way that I never could have imagined. And I studied this stuff. So
I
that's the
love it.
last thing I wanted to say. Also, just thank
Uh,
you so much for this interview.
well, I appreciate and keep reading your stuff and sharing it out there. And ultimately, I say we're really doing the work for the plants because they're the
Yes,
true predators and we're the prey. But
you are
ultimately,
right.
we do love the plants. So,
We do.
all right, my
We
brother.
do.
Thank you so
All right,
much.
brother.
We'll
Thank
keep
you so
listening and
much.
learning.
All right. Thank
All
you.
right. God bless you.